Good morning, everyone, and behalf on the Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies, welcome to the penultimate session in the Resilient Societies track. In this session, which we have called Uncommon Ground, we aim to engage in dialogue and work towards a common ground about the roles of the society and the state. The issues to be explored include how can the state and the society coexist? What drives an imbalance of power from time to time? Why is it that at times there is a tension between samaaj and sarkaar? And are there ways to think of the two as complementary in the context of citizen welfare? Before we begin, a few housekeeping rules for the audience. There are two windows or tabs to your right. The chat window for conversation on topics being discussed. We encourage you to let us know your thoughts throughout the session. And a Q&A window explicitly for questions you may have. Ask your questions throughout the session as well, and the most upvoted ones will be picked up and driven towards the speakers throughout the session. We hope to run the session for about 50 minutes. With that, let me now hand over to our moderator for the session, Gopal Sankar Narayanan, a senior advocate of the Supreme Court of India, the youngest to have been so recognized in the last 25 years. Gopal, thank you for being here, and over to you to introduce our speakers and drive the session forward.
Thank you so much, Yash. Um, I always find myself a little at a lack of ease when I'm faced with the prospect of having giants in our field like Yamini and Jasmine here. I've always read with great interest about the various opinions that Yamini has put across and the work that she's done at the Center for Policy Research, which she is now commandeering from the front, and the kind of changes that she has brought within the organization as well. And with Jasmine, who is an old friend now for a while, and the work that he does with the Delhi Dialogue and Development Commission, I think it's fantastic that people like Jasmine are on the other side. We look at him as one of us, members of civil society, and the work that he has been doing has been exemplary. I know there must be great difficulties and challenges that he has been facing while on the other side, and the criticism that he faces, and we'll explore all of that in the coming minutes. I don't know if I need a broader credentials and details regarding the two of them. Most people know them. Yamini Iyer has a historic association with civil society, and her work at the Center for Policy Research, where she's the president and chief executive, stands out. Jasmine Shah has previously worked with JPAL in the US and comes from Columbia University. Here, he is the head of the vice chairperson of the Delhi Dialogue and Development Commission. Welcome, Yamini and Jasmine, to this session, which is called Coexistence Between Strong Society and Strong State. As a moderator, and this is uncommon for me, I was commenting to the person who invited me saying, you don't want someone like me. I'm a lawyer. I go to courts. I get into arguments. And usually it's very difficult for me to moderate discussions. But it's something that I'm going to slowly find my way somehow today with the help of the two of you. And I'll keep my comments to a minimum. If I can just start by inviting the two of you, Jasmine first, if that's okay, to give us some introductory remarks about the topic. I had a conversation earlier with Jasmine, and I found that he had something to say about the way the topic itself was framed, which is the coexistence between strong society and strong state. I think we are in the throes of a very vital discussion about the role that government, but particularly in India, is playing in many parts across the world, where we have what they call themselves strong governments in Turkey and in Brazil, etc. I'd like to hear your views, Jasmine, if you could just start and just tell us what you think.
Thank you, Gopal. And first of all, my wishes for a very happy Independence Day to all of you. It's a very serious topic. And, when I was just reading about the title of the topic, the first sort of thought in my mind, because we're talking about a balance between a strong state and a strong society, arguably civil society and markets. The apprehension I had when I first thought about it is this idea of a strong state. And I think different people might interpret it differently. We do want an efficient. So when we talk about state, if we're actually talking about government, then what I would argue is that you don't want a strong government, because we are seeing examples of that all over the world as well as in India, as to when a government tries to overreach and therefore impinge upon the rights of the other actors of the society, what kind of outcomes we get. So we want an efficient government. We want a government that acts as a facilitator. It recognizes the legitimate roles of the other key stakeholders in the society, civil society or the private sector, and is not, uh, you know, hell bent to sort of dictate terms to the other actors, and gives them a legitimate space. Of course, state also means the judiciary and other organs of the state, and there arguably you do want a strong and an independent judiciary. But as much as it relates to the role of the government, I would say the idea of a strong government is somewhat worrisome. Um, you know, I mean, of course, I think at the outset, this idea that yes, a resilient society needs a very strong balance and a feeling, a sense of mutual respect between the state and the samaj, the sarkar, and the bazaar. I completely subscribe to it, and the converse is also true, which is a state that is trying too hard to control or dictate terms to the civil society or the markets, or it could also be where private sector or private players are able to effectively dictate terms to the state about what policies should be implemented, or a civil society which tries as hard as it could but is not able to influence the policies, or how the state acts. And these are all markers, I would say, of a weak democracy. Now, obviously, I think when we talk about India's experience, we've had a range. I don't think we exist in either of these extremes at all points in time. But I would argue that in the current context, we see far too many examples of the latter, where there is a weakening of this equilibrium or a desired balance between the role of the state and the society. And just a couple of examples that come first to my head is this ongoing farmers' agitation. Just the way the bills were brought about in the parliament, in the middle of a pandemic through an ordinance where you didn't even have a discussion, they were passed, in hurry burry. And after months and months of agitations, where so many hundreds of farmers have lost their lives, the state still doesn't seem to be in a discussion mode. We just had a day or two ago an example of a union minister calling out the private sector and calling it anti-national. So I think these are all, as much as the state would like to profess that it respects the boundaries of what the state ought to do, these are examples that show you that we are far away from where we ought to be. I would say, therefore, that yes, while center, this is how things are at the center. Somewhat the onus of what, therefore, this equilibrium between the samaj and the sarkar should look like should therefore fall also on state governments and opposition parties, because that's the beauty of the federal structure, that when you have something, an undesirable sort of an example, then there are opportunities that others have to show, okay, how would you want to reimagine this kind of a balance? Are there other models possible within our constitutional framework? And I think this is the sort of an opportunity that state governments have. I'm going to uh, speak maybe for another 2 minutes, Gopal, about the experience in Delhi, because I think that I would say throws up a counter as to some of the things that I feel would sort of, in a way, this balance has been thought about in Delhi. So now Delhi, of course, is a very interesting and a unique example, because the party in power itself has emerged from a civil society movement. So the people today, the ministers and the elected government, are people who have spent long time agitating and being part of the civil society. Uh, and therefore, this idea of negotiating with the civil society, talking to the civil society, is not alien, right? Um, there are a couple of examples that I can, and over the discussion, we can talk more about the experiences in Delhi. But I would say the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic shows up as multiple instances where the government could not have done it alone, and it is because right from day one that we had this attitude of collaboration and working together with actors outside the government. Of course, there are layers of government within Delhi that was essential to coordinate with, but the civil society and the private sector, they all really came together to respond to the pandemic. And if you're talking about resilient societies, I think COVID-19 throws up just the perfect backdrop for how resilient societies can respond to crises like this. So, Delhi at its peak was providing 2 million cooked meals per day at the time of the first lockdown. So 20 lakh cooked meals, and that was all the RWAs, NGOs, all of them combined, but coordinated by DMs and the state management agency. Even with the private sector, Delhi, I remember the first time Delhi launched an app showing the real time availability of COVID-19 beds in private as well as government hospitals. There was a lot of resistance from private hospitals as to how can we update this is not practical, but it was series of discussions after which these hospitals was brought on board. And this was all led by the health minister of Delhi. And I think that sense of trust happens when you take the effort to indulge in a dialogue and actually hear out the concerns of the other side, which I would say was done. And during the second wave, a lot of, I would say, resource mobilization, oxygen cylinder, oxygen plant. This is when the entire society chipped in. And DDC, especially, my commission was at the forefront of coordinating a lot of these efforts. So that is one. The second example that comes to my mind is, how do you systematically create role for civil society in governance? I think this was one of the themes of the discussion as well. And in Delhi, I would say the school management committees and the work that has happened in the education, reforms throws up an excellent case study. So school management committees were always, required to be there as part of the RTE. But like in most parts of India, they were practically defunct. Elections wouldn't happen on time, and parents, therefore, and civil society would not have a say in how the government schools are run. But Delhi government has consistently ensured that proper elections are held, and these are active bodies with powers and with budgets who can actually hold the school administrations accountable. And I would say a lot of the work that we see today in Delhi government schools is because the school management committees actually, we've breathed, we've put life into those ideas which otherwise exist. And therefore, I would say that as a state, there is, I mean, unfortunately, civil society will always continue to play an important role, but the extent to which it directly participates in the governance depends on the government. Whether you are going to create these formal opportunities of engagement and give them a legitimate role and space in decision making, accountable, ensuring there is checks and balances, or do you keep it ad hoc? That every time a civil society wants, you have to protest or you have to really approach, write 10 letters, make 15, 20 calls, and then wait for your voice to be heard. So I'll limit my opening remarks to that. Thank you.
Yeah, Jasmine, thank you for all those opening remarks. Just quickly, if I can pitch in to say this, that I think, as I can't speak for the citizens of Delhi, but I think what we have seen last year and this year, with both the movement of the migrant labor and this year with the second wave of COVID, has taught us that governments in big cities, both Bombay and Delhi, especially the way it was plagued this year by COVID, um, like to take credit for a lot of things that they don't do. And if at all, as a citizen of Delhi, and we saw what rolled out during April and May, I think a lot of the credit actually goes to the citizens of Delhi for having come together. I agree that your commission would have played a role, but perhaps not a lead role is what I would suggest. And I would like to invite Yamini to uh, her opening remarks, particularly with reference to where Jasmine was saying the opposition and the media, and I believe even other institutions would play an important role between Samaj and Sarkar. I think it's important that we have strong institutions as well. And would you like to come in on that?
Thank you, Gopal, and thank you, Jasmine, and to the Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies for inviting me to this really important conversation, and very apt that we are having this conversation on Independence Day. I think our independence movement, our freedom movement itself, is a living historical example of how effectively the people shape a nation state, and I think that should be at the center and core of what it means to build a resilient society and a strong state. I think Jasmine set us off on a very important discussion, which I think he makes an important conceptual. He's pushing us to think to make an important conceptual distinction, or rather a conceptual definition of what we mean by strong states. And I would say that it might be worth pushing that further to make a distinction between an authoritarian state and a strong state. I think a lot of the examples that Jasmine was presenting to us are more examples of authoritarian states. I think of strong states as states that have genuine legitimacy. In democratic societies, that legitimacy comes from society. So I see strong societies and strong states as having a very deep synergy. You will get the structure. States, after all, are embedded, or the institutions of the state are embedded in society. So a strong, robust society builds a strong, robust state, not an authoritarian state that pushes its own version of law upon people, but a state that is genuinely responsive to the legitimate concerns of citizens who have, as part of the core social contract, given it the power to take decisions on its behalf. I also think it's really important for us to make another conceptual distinction, which is, I think, at the heart of what I define as a strong state, which is capability of a state. The state is peopled of institutions and individuals that together create the architecture of the state. And it is the capability, by which I mean the capacity of the state to genuinely leverage these individuals and their technical capacities to work towards a common purpose and a common good. When the state fails to do so, when institutions fail to do so, when institutions lose their sense of purpose, that is when you have weak states. And by the way, I think authoritarian states can be very weak states too, because no matter how much power the state will have, its ability to actually enable all those institutions and individuals that make the architecture of the state to operate along a certain set of goals and objectives may not be effective, because the goals and objectives of the institution and the individuals may be distinct from the goals and objectives of the institutions. I think capable, strong states are states where individuals align towards a mission, a goal, an objective, and the institutional architecture of that institution, where powers are placed, how the checks and balances respond to one another, all are collectively aligned towards the pursuit of that mission, towards the pursuit of that goal. That's what makes for a strong state, and that goal will only inevitably be defined through the synergies that we build between state and society. Democracy is about the creation of strong states. Democracies are weak when we throw up authoritarian states, and when we throw up states with weak organizational capability, states that are not able to ensure that the goals of the state are effectively met. So to my mind, that's the conceptual distinction I make. And when I think of a strong state, I think of a capable state. I think of a state that is genuinely responsive to the needs and priorities of the citizens that it seeks to represent, and a state that is effectively held accountable by citizens, i.e. it responds and citizens have the capability to articulate their voice to that state. And the state isn't captured by vested interests, whether those are interests of capital or interests of politics or interests of kinship, ethnicity, religion, and so on. So, and I believe very strongly that that is the imagination of our Constitution. Our Constitution sought to build a strong, capable state, but it also sought to do so in the context of a fractured society and potentially a somewhat less resilient society. And I think our founding fathers anticipated that through the instruments of law and through the instruments of politics, that they would effectively effectively be able to engineer a strong, resilient society. So I think, and I think that's the tension that continues to be played out in India, even as we celebrate our 75th, in the context of what is a very fractured democracy, and in some ways a remaking of what effectively we are as a society, and how therefore we should be represented in our politics and in our state. That's the tension that lies, I think, at the heart of this tension between resilient societies, strong societies, and I would take Jasmine's framing of strong state as authoritarian state, which is also part and parcel of the tensions that we are engaging with. I think that one of the beauties, the beauties and challenges of Indian society and the Indian state comes from the fact that we were an unusual democracy. All political science literature that was written back in the 50s and 60s looked at India with a lot of surprise. How was it that a country as fractured as ours managed to cohere around a democratic promise and sustain its democratic promise? And embedded in that democratic promise was a very robust, organized civil society. Not so much an informal civil society in this, because of the nature of our fractures. We don't often come together necessarily in our everyday lives, but we had a very strong organized civil society that was effectively able to prize open spaces to articulate and push democracy in different ways and forms. Some of those achievements came in the form of the 73rd and 74th Amendment to the Constitution that sought to push democracy closer to people, to borrow from sociologist Patrick Heller, sort of expanding the surface area of the state and bringing the state closer to citizens was in some ways a normative goal of the 73rd and 74th Amendment. The presence of a very robust media, the fourth estate, that with the exception of a blip of few years in the late 70s, more or less performed its function of putting in checks and balances, of the courts that also put in similar checks and balances. And in fact, the courts and civil society came together in a very deep alliance through the entire push of creating a rights-based welfare architecture, which also tells you about the effectiveness of and the possibilities of when institutions of the state and institutions of society come together to prize open and push for deeper democracy. I think all of these, the right to information, the right to work, all of these are really important examples of the effectiveness of the synergies of state and society that together create strong states and resilient societies. I think we are now in the current moment at an important impasse. And there are three elements of that impasse that I feel we must interrogate if we genuinely want to create a resilient society, which in turn will build a strong, robust, capable state. First and foremost, I think our markets run the risk of deep capture. The relationship between capital and politics, or what we call crony capital, is strong, it's embedded. And one of the reasons why the idea of free markets doesn't have deep credibility in the Indian discourse, especially when we start, like in the farm laws, pushing for market reforms in the everyday lives of people that affect them in ways which are very different to capital market reforms, is because one of the downsides of 1991 is that it threw up a very, very embedded relationship between the state and capital. So that's the first, I think, and when capital starts running the state, society doesn't have an effective voice. The second big challenge that we confront is that as a society too, we are deeply fractured, and we haven't quite enabled a robust dialogue amongst ourselves. And I think that shows up in our politics again and again, on what is the collective legitimacy of the state. What is it that we are asking of the state, and how do we build that? The 1990s saw a moment of lower caste political mobilization that threw up new forms of democratic politics, particularly in North India. Did those necessarily create the opportunities for deepening socio-economic rights in India? We see this again again, all the way into our present, the absence of a collective dialogue within society and between society and state on socio-economic rights remains a big lacuna, with the occasional uprising up of space through organized civil society. But that dialogue needs to continue to happen in India. And in fact, I think we are losing the spaces for that dialogue to happen because our politics is now pushing us in a more polarized way. The third aspect of this has been the complete, and I think again, the relationship with capital and the relationship with politics plays in, has been almost the attempt at bypassing the mediating institutions of society that shape the relationship between politics and people. Technology enables a direct relationship between state and individuals, between politicians and individuals. We talk about direct benefit transfers. Twitter allows our politicians to speak directly to people. The media gets cut out or bought or cut out. But the media plays a very, very important intermediation role. And that role is losing. The courts are also going through their own churnings. So I think the third biggest crisis to building strong societies and building synergies between state and society lie in the weakening and deliberate bypassing of the mediating institutions of society that ought to be the that shape relationships between individuals and the state, between societies and the state. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Yamini. In fact, I found those 3 points very, very interesting. And I wanted to use the middle one, the collective dialogue one, as a springboard to ask Jasmine this. The constitution which Yamini was talking about and the ideas that the founding fathers had at the outset, one of those ideas I think seems to have been lost in every discourse we have about the constitution, which is about the idea of fraternity. We talk about equality and liberty all the time, but fraternity hardly ever comes into it. Even in the phrasing of this very conversation we are having, it's about between the state and the society, but it's not about among members of society themselves. So civil society, for example, is not a monolith. There are different groups, each of whom believe that they represent civil society. And to have a conversation where we all look out for each other in the absence of, and this is something that I've commented on before, the US has a Civil Rights Act. So you have it enforced by law to ensure that you honor constitutional obligations and tenets vis-a-vis each other. We don't have that in India. Now, in a scenario like that, and in a situation where we have these cleavages in society, which are exploited by our politicians, do you think that whenever we talk about bringing society and state together and having a conversation and having accountability and transparency as far as our institutions are concerned, isn't it equally important for us to ensure that we have people in society on the same plane? We've spent a large amount of time exploiting ideas of caste and religion in this country. And in recent years, even ideas of region to a large extent. But the important ideals of education and health and employment are lost. They are gone by the wayside. The Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi attempts to address at least education and health in a big way, and you have your outcome budgets which are supposed to try and explain how it is spent, etc. Can you just take us through what your broad ideas are on this?
Sure, Gopal. I think there are, I'll also don my former civil society hat because I have spent a few years on the other side. And there is a challenge that even on seemingly, when there is a consensus that there are important issues to be addressed, we do see, tension among civil society organizations, and therefore what eventually gets communicated to the state or the government in terms of how the civil society would want the outcome, let's say on a policy matter, to be, tends to be confusing. Part of it is natural, but I think that's somewhere the evolution, the organic evolution of our own civil society. As far as the state is concerned, you mentioned about outcome budget. Let me very briefly for the audience talk about this initiative of Delhi government. So one of the, we do price transparency and accountability, that the fact that governments ought to make itself accountable, and that needs deliberate effort. To say that, I am transparent, so ask me any questions, but what is it that the citizens have to ask questions about, or how can media really understand what's really happening with your budgetary spending? um, you know, Yamini is one of the at the forefront of thinking about these issues in the country. But the experience that we, and it's still a work in progress. But 3 or 4 years back, Delhi government completely reformed its outcome budgeting exercise, where we tied. Today, we have around 80% of our budgetary spending, which is linked to around 2,500 indicators, very neatly bucketed into output indicators, which is what the government ought to do, and outcome indicators, which is that if the government has done its work, how did the people benefit from it? So if you built 100 or 500 molar clinics, did people actually show up and benefit from those services or not? And I think it creates for us as a government also to be able to really understand where are things going wrong or not, and hold the administration accountable. It was an important tool. But more importantly, and over time, the Delhi media as well as the people have started using this as a real asset, because this kind of data and information across scheme year on year, and in fact quarter on quarter. So we release the status on each of these indicators every quarter, has become a powerful tool for the entire society to actually hold the government's performance to account. um, Final point I would like to make is, because you touched the idea of fraternity, and I think, I fundamentally think that the reason why states tend to think very different when it comes to really sitting down together, let's say with civil society, in that spirit of fraternity and sorting out issues, is because we have bucketed them as institutions in silos. There's very little lateral movement that happens between the two. So this appreciation of each other's perspectives is almost, I would say, at a level artificial. Now, I will talk about my own journey and example. As I've been in the civil society, I've been in the private sector before that. Today, when I'm sitting in the government, and if a civil society body approaches us, there is a natural inclination to hear the voices. But the natural inclination for many people at the top levels of government, I'm talking in generality, uh, is to avoid these conversations. So if there is somebody who approaches you with a seriously different view than what, say, the government is taking, the idea is, okay, how not to meet them, and how not to even get that can of worms open. And I think the more we create opportunities for lateral movement, where people who have experienced the other part of the society can come, and of course, politics is the medium of that, but I'm saying maybe beyond politics, even maybe in administration, there have been attempts in the past, not so very encouraging, but I think, I mean, it's good to talk about these as ideas and values, but how do we actually bring them into practice is where I think the discussion needs to move to. And I feel, I mean, and you see that in US, you see people, after you know Trump government, or let's say the Obama government left office, many of the people joined back the civil society and businesses. Once their government is back in power, they come again. So there are these sort of, and that creates bridges and partnerships which otherwise you wouldn't have seen.
Thanks, Jasmine. I think it's very important to know about your own journey, and I think very often we tend to conflate the individual with the kind of ideas they represent. So we'll always appreciate Jasmine Shah, the person, but the governments and the policies, those are left open to criticism. And having been from civil society, you can understand that. Yamini, I just wanted to ask you this, because I think this is the third point that you had touched upon, about how politicians, especially, and those in government, bypassing the traditional institutions which would mediate, and reaching out to the citizenry, and partly social media has played a big role in this. Now, social media itself seems to be, to a large extent, at least the intermediaries seem to be under the cosh quite a bit. The Twitters and the WhatsApps and the Facebooks, etc., etc. And by governments around the world are, putting them under siege in a way. I wanted to ask you, in these conversations that government and those in government are expected to have with civil society, are there certain bridges which are irrevocable, which bridges need to be as robust as possible? The media is clearly one of them, and the opposition is perhaps another. Are there other institutions that you think act as a bridge rather than governmental institutions which are available of that kind of control, which ought to be independent, like say the CBI or the RBI or things like that. The judiciary is anyway supposed to be independent for the large part. But are there other institutions that you think play an important role? And today we might be seeing a situation where people in these strong governments think that, look, we don't need these institutions at all. We can just completely ignore them and we're not going to get any flack for it. It's not going to make any difference at the hustings.
Yeah, I think the challenge is not so much that there's a challenge of the present, but I think we need to look back and ask ourselves why, as a society, we have actually actively failed to build genuinely robust institutions. Period. I mean, let's take the university. The great gems of India that produced that continue till today to produce some of the world leaders, our IITs, our IIMs. But you look around today, and most of the elite, all of us who are talking to each other, if any of us have children, the thing that we are doing right now is saving our money to spend when they go to college, not in India, because we have broken the university system, but going off somewhere else to study. It tells you something. And the reason why I bring up the university is because a lot of what we've been talking about, where do you build the core of a resilient, robust society? Where do you build genuine deliberation and architecting of new ideas? You build them through the university system. You build them through these institutions. But collectively, if you go back all the way, in fact, my own think tank, which I joined in the mid 2000s, one of the standing jokes was this is like a refugee of scholars who would more ideally like to be in the university. Not me. I'm not one of them, but many of my colleagues are or were, and it has a lot to do with the fact that we didn't actually we had allowed for institutions to atrophy, because in fact, and this is at the heart, the challenge of what does it take to build genuinely strong institutions that are capable, that work towards a collective mission and towards a collective goal, had been reduced to compliances, paperwork, and bureaucratic and political capture. So I think that our inability, one of the big challenges with India is, even though we have a very robust civil society that prizes open spaces for democratic deliberation, that has not translated into building strong institutions that are genuinely meant for deliberation, dialogue, engagement, and responsiveness between state and society. Another really important example, the 73rd and 74th Amendment, genuinely meant to create deliberative, dialogue, democratic spaces at the grassroots, where so many of the things that Jasmine is talking about, monitoring of outcome budgets, strengthening the school management committee, the day-to-day interaction between the citizen and the state takes place at a very granular level. It doesn't take place necessarily through creation of laws or policies. That is where the experts, people like you, come in as the voices and the mediators. It's in the everyday. Is the teacher showing up in my school? Has the roof been properly fixed? Is there a doctor in the health care center? I've not got my ration card, my Aadhaar card. Where do I go to articulate my grievance? I want to fight against my not being put into the SECC list. Where do I go? These are the everyday relationships that citizens forge with the state. Those are the relationships that need to be built on the back of rights, not on the back of. That's where genuine citizenship is expressed and articulated. And those are the institutions that every arm of government has done everything to undermine. The state governments. I'm a great advocate for deeper federalism and a great advocate for state rights. But I have to say, I often find it very difficult to push the state argument, because if I start looking at state finance commissions, they're pretty broken and they're doing everything within their power not to decentralize and devolve powers to municipalities and to local governments. Every level of government in India loves decentralization, Raja Chalaya said, but only up to their level. That's the challenge. We don't actually build institutions that enable genuine deliberation, and therefore citizen voices get articulated through mediating organized civil society, people like you and me sometimes, who don't necessarily represent all voices, politics often finds it easy then to give up to us rather than to enable a genuine compromise between citizens and state. And now politicians have discovered the beauty of actually getting rid of all the intermediary mediating institutions, because I can directly speak to the people and I can use tools of technology to also directly deliver to people, which means that there's less need to hold press conferences, there's less need to fight for free press. And there's also less need to create genuine spaces for deliberation and dialogue, because now we've made it difficult for dissenting voices to articulate their views. And I think that's one of the critical challenges. A robust democracy requires robust spaces of deliberation. These need to be built from the bottom up. The SMCs that Jasmine was talking about are a very important example of an effort to do so, but how that speaks to the municipal government remains a question. Delhi has a particularly unique architecture, but you look across the country, we have undermined every single local government. Even in COVID, Kerala managed to do relatively better because local governments are stronger, but many other states don't have that infrastructure. That's a living example of why you need strong local governments.
I think the Kerala reference brings to us the question of education again. You were responsible for setting up the accountability initiative dealing with education at CPR. And we have with us Jasmine, who is overseeing the outcome budgets, particularly with reference to education as well, at the Dialogue Commission. I was wondering, Yamini, could you just tell us, because I think there would be an overlap here. I'm just curious, what has your experience been at CPR about the difference that, if there is any, and I'm presuming there is, that the Delhi dispensation of the AAP has brought in with reference to outcomes as far as education is concerned? Could you share that experience? Maybe we can start there.
Sure. In fact, we've just finished putting the last touches on a research report that we've written based on the experience of schools in Delhi. The colleagues and I spent about 3 years doing an ethnographic study of the shifts that were taking place. I think, without getting into all of those details, I think one of the really important things that's worth talking about here, we often lament that the biggest challenge of, or rather the biggest puzzle of Indian democracy is why a democracy has chosen not to prioritize health and education, which are the two most central aspects of what impacts the capabilities of citizens to participate in markets effectively and to be able to genuinely build their capabilities to do so. I think, dreams have been written over about this puzzle. Occasionally, some politicians have attempted to do a few things. Those things have been limited to at most doing the visible things. So build the infrastructure, build put in all the inputs, hire the teachers to a degree, ensure that there's some action happening, and then learning will happen on its own. I think what was genuinely different about the effort that the government of Delhi has done was that it was willing to say that students enter our schools and even in standard 6 they can barely read, period. And it has tried to push a dialogue with teachers to get teachers to start trying to think about the classroom not as a place where you have to complete the syllabus and maximize the top 3 rows of the classroom that are closer to the curriculum to pass the exam, because that as a society and as a government is what we care about, but to actually start interrogating their pedagogy and ask themselves why students can go through years of schooling and are still unable to answer and are still unable to pick up the basics. It's not a quick exercise. It's not an easy exercise. It's not going to give you genuine results. It's not going to give you quick results immediately. But this is what deep reform means. Deep reform requires deliberation and a shift in how organizations think of themselves. And interestingly also, the one thing that is important is that actually regardless of the quick or non-quick, and there are many failures in all reforms, what Delhi government has been trying in schools has had some success, not full success, but this becomes core to the political legitimacy of a political party. And I think that's the lesson that our politics needs to learn, that politics doesn't always have to mirror society. Politics can also sometimes seek to create genuine legitimacy for its actions by demonstrating possibility, and that legitimacy then creates the consensus between state and society for genuine change. Beyond education, I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we face in India when we talk about religion and politics. Very often political parties now are shying away from using certain vocabulary that sort of represents ideas that are of tolerance, of pluralism, of secularism that have now been delegitimized. And parties tend to worry about what happens to the Hindu vote across all opposition parties. Why do we not have a robust response to the ideological challenges we confront today? And I think it's because we have to remember that politics also has to articulate a set of values, a set of norms, a set of and build legitimacy around ideas, rather than responding to the immediate voter sort of, what the voter survey tells you about voter preferences. Politics has to lead the way. I think in education, the government of Delhi certainly has shown that it can, and it does over time yield genuinely good results on the ground.
Thanks, Yamini. I think we'd be looking forward to that report whenever you put it out. We have some questions from people in the audience. I'd like to put one out, which comes from Kriti Shukla. She says, Arvind Subramaniam made a strong point on how India followed a different model and got to democracy before it got to development. This is visible in how our politics and public institutions work. What is the panel's view on this? We have examples of countries like Botswana and Singapore, which possibly decided to take a bludgeon to try and clean the place up and get to development before opening it up and democratizing. Do you think we lost a chance there?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead. I'll take it after you.
All right. No, so I think I mean, there is evidence. There are theories in political science devoted to this subject. But I'm a big believer in what Amartya Sen had said, that countries become fit through democracy and not for democracy. And there are obviously models available. I mean, authoritarian states who have delivered development, but at what cost to civil liberties and at other rights of marginalized groups and many other things that are Constituent Assembly debated heavily about is all out there. I do genuinely believe that the example of India and the early stages of sort of navigating the tension whether we would continue to stay a democracy or not, we've passed that stage much long back, and that stands out as, I would say, a north pole for many emerging democracies. I think the challenge now for us is to reach for the next bar, which is that yes, we can sustain as a vibrant democracy, right? Where there are multiple levels, there's a federal structure, there are pillars of the state, but resilient society, and that's what the topic is, that eventually we need to also be able to get through the deep developmental inequality that exists in the state, because again, the constitution talks about equality of all kinds. It's not just the rights, and therefore the disparities that we see in education, if you're born in a rich family or a poor family, you get very different outcomes in education, healthcare, average wages that we have, and the inequality then. And I think those inequalities are actually increasing over time. And like Yamini said, politics, I mean, there's been a lot of debate as to when will education, health, and these kind of development issues come to the center of politics, because unless that happens, you are not going to see a marked shift. And it took an Aam Aadmi Party and a Delhi government to say that as a tenet of our belief, we are going to allocate 25% of our budget to education, where the average across the country is 10 to 12%. And it was, as I said, a tenet of belief, and we've stuck on to that. And we talk about it proudly, even when we ask for the votes of people that vote for us, if you think we have worked in education, health, and matters that matter to the daily lives of citizens. Unfortunately, I don't see those at the center of election speeches, election related conversations in other parts of the state. And I think that's the open question as to how quickly do we see this kind of politics gain currency in other parts of India.
Yamini?
I, I actually, Jasmine said most of what I wanted to say. I think it's not an either or. It's about what kind of society you want to build, and what are the values, norms, and what is your definition of progress. I think that India's great strength lies in her democracy and in the fact that we are a genuinely diverse country that comes together as a nation state, and we should be fighting to preserve that, not arguing whether that is the reason why we are not economically doing as fast as doing as well. I think that we must also remember that some of the most politically chaotic years for India were the years where our GDP numbers looked strongest. So that should be a lesson in why democracy is important to economic development.
Now, the Prime Minister in his speech this morning apparently again mentioned this phrase, Atmanirbhar. It's something that I find strange and odd. I have looked up a dictionary and it tells me that it means self-reliance. At a time of COVID, I would not expect the leader of the nation to be telling us to be self-reliant, especially when health and its facilities are largely in in government hands, and the private sector is way too expensive and difficult to afford. I wanted to know what your views are on a concept like Atmanirbhar, and when, if at all, uh, it could be called upon on society to exercise it. Because if we are a welfare state and we have reached a level of perfection with our institutions and our level of access to it, then I can perhaps understand that you say, look, everything is in place, you handle it. But when things are in a deplorable state, how does one call upon citizenry to actually participate in that manner? Yamni?
The Atmanirbhar sort of seems to represent many things at the same time. I'm not quite clear what exactly, it's sort of been articulated also as an economic policy where we're looking much more protectionist. It's being articulated in different ways, I think. But to the larger point, what is resilience? I think resilience is a society which is strong, which it has, where the state has legitimacy, where the state is responsive to the needs of citizens, and the state is genuinely inclusive. And societies are resilient when all citizens have equal opportunity. That's the path that we need to move towards. One where the state responds and creates an enabling environment for all citizens to have equal opportunity.
Jasmine, we have a hard stop at 12, so if I could just leave you with concluding remarks.
All right. Very quickly, I have always been confused about Atmanirbhar as well, Gopal. I genuinely believe that the fundamental concern of the state should be welfare of its people, not hold itself to ideologies which may actually be detrimental, right? And we have seen, in the economic journey of our nation, as to how finally when we opened up, how people did started enjoying a better quality of life. So so long as that is what is being prioritized, which I don't see happening. I mean, beyond the rhetoric, there's very little to show what is it that people are going to get genuinely a better deal out of these slogans. But no, I mean, final comments. I mean, very, very interesting discussion. And I again believe that for a resilient society, yes, our constitution and the way democracies function, states do have an anchor role. Um, you know, we talk about a strong state versus an authoritarian state. I agree with that distinction, but a state really does need to play that anchor role, play that role of a facilitator, if we really are going to bring in the synergies of what a civil society, private sector, and average citizens can contribute to governance. And unless and until this idea that I want to hold power and I want to therefore use power to sort of, uh, you know, uh, really do what I wish to do, rather than come to a consensus about what are the best ideas and therefore track, monitor, and then implement them. I think that's the kind of opposing models that we are seeing today, and we'll see. how it comes, goes by in the years to come.
I want to thank both Jasmine and Yamini so much for having participated and shared their thoughts, and to the Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies for having held this session. And thank you for inviting me as a moderator. I was trying to ensure that I don't say Jamini and Yasmin throughout. But thank you very, very much for having us together at this session. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for being here. On to the next session. Being the founders, philanthropies, actives, audience, please